I was writing a script for a new video about how to pick a modern Yu-Gi-Oh deck to play with, and it was, well, rough. Yu-Gi-Oh right now is in a Tier 0 format, meaning that there's only one deck or strategy that's viable. Of course, I still could have made a deck choice guide work, being more of an explanation of the top engine and its variants, and then the few rogue decks that counter it or have a slim chance. But my anger at the newest meta deck and how awful it is for new players helped me finally put into words the change in Yu-Gi-Oh that has been manifesting for a while now. It's a bit roundabout, but let me explain by talking about the evolution of card effects. In the earliest eras of Yu-Gi-Oh, which I'll call Classic Yu-Gi-Oh, cards tended to be designed around performing one specific generic action. A card can do anything, but it tended to be focused around doing one thing. Power-wise, these cards would be all over the place, but they'd be simple. It would feel like almost every card from this era could be used in the early series of the anime. In the middle era of Yu-Gi-Oh, three things would change. First, there would be a gradual creep in the cards having multiple effects. Obviously, this would be a thing in earlier formats of Yu-Gi-Oh, but now they'd start to feel commonplace and baked into the design of new cards. The second change is the pushing of archetypes. You'd see these pioneered with earlier strategies like Elemental Heroes and Gladiator Beast, but it would really start to define the game after 2008-2009. Lastly, the type of effects themselves would begin to change. We'd get archetypal searches, new methods to special summon from the deck, and even the introduction of XYZ and Synchros to summon from the extra deck. This is where the name Middle Yu-Gi-Oh comes from, because it's where Yu-Gi-Oh starts to shift into its modern design identity. Of course, that brings us to the question of what makes modern Yu-Gi-Oh different. Easy. A slightly higher level of searchability and the standardization of recursion. Here we'd see decks go crazy, with additional effects based around future plays and Plan B options on top of their already strong effects. While it first got hard previewed in Dragon Ruler format, this definitely became the norm after 2014. Almost every meta deck from this period could have used recursion. Shadal's, Performage, Monarch, Zodiac, Gokis, and not to mention the whole pendulum mechanic got introduced here. So you'd have these decks, with the previously established archetypes and deck utilization, but now with recursion options built in to outgrind your opponents. It's the invention of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! I call the next era postmodern Yu-Gi-Oh! Because it makes a friend of mine who doesn't play Yu-Gi-Oh! Laugh every time I show him the graphic. But I also call it postmodern because there's a trend of refining archetypes in the tighter and tighter engines and the standardization of hand traps. It's such a dramatic change in deck building, it almost feels like a deconstruction of the previous modern format. Like the eras before, we'd get a preview of this with Zodiacs. It's one of the neat trends of Yu-Gi-Oh! Where you'd end up with previews of later eras quite a bit earlier than when they would become the norm. The shift from modern into postmodern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is where most classic players tend to get lost. It's no wonder why, really. Complexity went through the roof. Decks have become so refined and fast that you not only need to navigate large portions of your deck each turn, but you're also going to be playing on turn 0. Decks have to make room for 9 to 12 different hand traps, and usually staple cards as well, or they'll struggle to enter the meta. Decks will often make heavier use of faster extenders to play around hand traps. Postmodern Yu-Gi-Oh! Is still a great game, but it's definitely not for everyone. So, what's the shift with the newest format? I have a list of changes I've noticed. 3 good effects is the norm, there are practically no restrictions, decks are fully designed to play around all hand traps, and archetypal hand traps are becoming a thing. The first item has the most potential for expanding the gameplay, but it's the most frustrating to deal with at the moment. You see, new decks tend to have cards with 3 powerful effects, specifically a conditional special summon, some type of recursion or protection effect, and then an additional effect to progress the game state. Take Snake-Eyes Popular. It summons itself when it's searched, it puts a fire monster to the field as an equip spell when it's sent to grave, and finally, it is a search when summoned. And another example, Lo the Prayer of the Voiceless Voice is a search, can be an entire tribute of a ritual monster, and is a free special summon that chain blocks. Sure, its Strategist of the Necros is in shambles right now. In previous formats, we saw Kashtira do the same thing. Take for example Fenrir, who is a free special summon, a free search, and a free disruption. The exceptions to this rule come from Telements, who put this effect on their practically free to summon extra deck monster, Telement Kikalos. Not to mention, this is supplemented with their in-archetype hand traps. More on this in a bit. It's also worth mentioning that there's also some decks like Sprite, Purrely, and Fire Kings, without this style effect, who get their increased power level from other places, respectively having insane extra deck plays, limited once per turn restrictions, and some of the most insane searchability and recursion. To me, these decks feel like a halfway point between postmodern Yu-Gi-Oh! And what's currently going on. I feel that it's fair to say that the best decks from recent formats abuse having more effects than the previous era. It helps them play around disruptions and hand traps, which have gotten crazier and somehow even more common than in the past era. Every starter and extender is designed to be able to start some significant combo line, be live after disruption, and still have an interaction for an opponent. I'd theorize that that's why this new style of effect trio is so common and isn't going anywhere. It's to facilitate interaction, and also drive new set sales. Following this up, I want to remind you that none of the cards mentioned before have any restrictions for using their effects. You aren't locked into anything after, nor do you have major restrictions for how to set up the requirements. Compared to an older archetype like Tri-Brigade, which would lock you into Beast, Wing Beast, and Beast Warriors, Diabelstar, Kashtira, and Voiceless Voice can do anything afterwards. It's why you can put Kashtira monsters generically into any deck as a go second tool, put Horse into any deck that cares about a graveyard, or use Snake-Eyes to retroactively buff any archetype with a level 1 fire monster. Seriously though, because the original Sinful Spoils isn't even archetype locked, it's one of the best staple extenders ever printed. In a previous format, original Sinful Spoils could have been a generic extender on its own. Now it's part of a combo that also draws a card and can set up board without any cost. Another example has the Purrely cards, lacking a once return clause. Also, we can't forget that Tearlaments are generic. Even other decks that do have restrictions have light and minor ones. Rights restrict to level 2, Rikus restrict to plants, and Unchained restrict to fiends. These are barely restrictions for the deck, and they can still be sequenced around to summon other stuff anyway. To put it in another way, restrictions have gotten so lax, Kashtira Fenrir can search himself. It's been Yu-Gi-Oh! Tradition for years to have cards be unable to search themselves, and we've gotten to the point where we no longer care, or honestly could even stop it. Just loop through a combo and search it anyway. I've mentioned the restriction removal in a previous video, but being more than a year into the future, we can confirm that it's just the standard now. Next up in the discussion is how modern decks have fully embraced design around hand traps. This means having both intentionally designed plays around hand traps, and sometimes having built-in hand traps themselves. Commonly and classically, we've seen decks get designed to be able to play around one or two of the most generic hand traps, like Ash Blossom, Infinite Impermanence, and Ghost Ogre. Modern decks not only have this in mind, but also come with obviously designed methods to play around more complex hand traps, like Nibiru, Draw and Lockbird, and even Max C. For the Draw and Lockbird example, it's very common for new spell archetypal searchers to be quick plays. That way they can be activated in the draw phase or in response to a draw activation. At first glance it's a small power creep, but it speeds up the game substantially. More decks also have unique follow-up plays against Nibiru. Usually these would just happen on their own, by being able to summon a negate prior to the 5th summon. But these new decks have more built-in methods, such as Divine Temple of the Snake-Eyes. It's so common for modern decks to just ignore Nibiru, that it was insanely notable that Kashtira couldn't play around it. It felt intentional from Konami. Lastly, Max C has definitely been affecting card design by giving decks optional low special summon plays or access to floodgates. Even if it's banned in the TCG, it's still legal in the OCG, which is where most of Yu-Gi-Oh's card design is done. The power creep of decks being able to play around hand traps runs alongside more decks getting their own unique hand traps. Previously, we've had Tearlament Ishizu, which had Tearlament's Havness, Kelback the Ancient Vanguard, and the ability to start combos from Herald of the Orange Light. This deck effectively played on either player's turn. Alongside this was the release of Bystials, an archetype that is literally composed of hand traps. Following this would be strategies like Labyrinth, with a constant stream of faster monster cards to play from hand, such as the Furniture and Arias the Labyrinth Butler. We've also had Rescue Ace with Rescue Ace Impulse, and most recently, Fire Kings with Fire King High Avatar Kirin. While not every deck gets a hand trap, it's very common for decks to get this type of support as an optional part of their strategy. To put all of this power creep into context, we have power creep decks like Sword Soul and Adventure, to an extent that is comparable to how Sky Striker's power creep Dino Rabbit. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has changed, and honestly I feel like it's mechanically changed for the better. There's more room than ever for counterplay and interaction from the top decks. Almost every deck has crazy options for grind games, and going second is finally starting to get a bit better. Skilled players who are okay with the ridiculous speed of Yu-Gi-Oh! Are having the time of their lives with the game right now. and what I've been able to play so far has been amazing. However, Konami has taken this dramatic shift in power creep as an opportunity to further scam and milk the player base dry. With the dramatic shift in power creep, new cards are of course required to stay competitive, and with how insane the change has been in Yu-Gi-Oh!, it's more of a baseline necessity now than it's ever been. This is nothing new, and is expected and even okay in a lot of scenarios. However, how these cards are distributed, priced, and then banned is a massive problem. Konami operates on one of the worst models. Compared to every other card game, Konami products give you the least value. Not only that, powerful cards are shifted up in rarity from their original Japanese release. This means a $1 rare in the OCG is often a $70 secret rare in the TCG. It's such a problem that the absurdly expensive deck of Fire King Snake-Eyes goes for about $1,100 in the TCG, yet only $200 in the OCG. That $200 is considered oddly expensive in the OCG. What I'm getting at is Konami is combining the power creep with exploitative product releases to force players into buying the newest cards at ridiculous markups and terrible prices. Konami has done this before, but it's definitely worse now. Here's the greatest hits from the past couple of years. Main set boxes are structured to only give you 2 secret rares and 4 ultra rares for your $80 to $90. This means it's going to be a base price of $40 to $45 per secret rare. With the bloated secret rare pools, you have a terrible chance to pull any cards you want, and it sends the price of a few staple cards to the moon. Meta-relevant structure decks now almost always have cards cut that they need for main sets, and in the past have had cards cut from the OCG release of these products. Deck build packs are overpriced garbage that don't give you enough ultra rares to do anything with, don't hold any value for customers, and don't even release with near complete archetypes. These have the same problems as base sets, but much more extreme. In side sets such as the Megatins, key cards are short printed or left at an artificially scarce rarity that isn't advertised in order to drive up card prices. And lastly, TCG Yu-Gi-Oh cards have the worst card quality out of any card game. This can be measured by bendability, damage resistance, card cores, and card thickness, not to mention the frequent misprints. All of this to milk the consumer dry while optimizing offering the least. I love the card game itself, but Konami's evil practices make it really hard to recommend and enjoy sometimes. It's why when I was writing a deck choice guide, it really hurt me to have to recommend some of those decks. There were no other real options that weren't affected by Konami's awful actions. And I don't want to be the guy to lie to you, or I have to tell you that you're not going to be successful in the community unless you fork over the money. Honestly, sometimes it feels like you're not even welcome in the community unless you have money. Let's be real. Succeeding at events in some of these formats without the correct expensive tools is either practically impossible or requires 20 times the level of skill or luck to succeed. I feel like there's already too much of this in real life. This is supposed to be a game. A game about making friends and building connections. Kazuki Takahashi, Yu-Gi-Oh's creator, didn't even want cash prizes at events because he didn't like what it did to the spirit of the game. We're so far from that now, it just leaves me feeling sad. Why isn't there a single TCG company, outside of Pokemon, that can do a consistently good job at managing their game's accessibility? Oh well. I hope y'all didn't mind this more negative video. I usually try to be neutral or positive, but it just wasn't happening with today's topic. If you feel like I was able to put what Konami be doing with Okay, I wrote this in the script as you feel like I was able to put what Konami's be doing with power creep in the words, go ahead and subscribe. You just Konami's be doing with power creep. It would help the channel out if you subscribe. Lord knows I only need about 300,000 more views before I can afford a snake-eyes deck. If y'all still want a deck choice guide for this format, let me know in the comments and I'll release one anyway. I'll just add a big disclaimer about what to expect, and I'll try not to be poor and salty with my delivery. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.